Good afternoon. The purpose of this video is very specific. I'm creating this video specifically for support organization as well as anybody that is trying to troubleshoot F5 CIS and IPAM. So I presented to the F5 support organization, provided them some documentation, some PowerPoints, etc. Talked a little bit about the architectures of how F5 CIS and the F5 IPAM controller work. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to follow up with a detailed troubleshooting guide. And it's very specific, the troubleshooting guide, and I want to go through some things that I've kind of learned over the last couple of days as I've been trying to troubleshoot an issue that kind of cropped up. And so I want to share my learning experience and record it here and just use YouTube as the platform to host this video. So if anybody does have any issues and is trying to troubleshoot this IPAM controller, they have some type of idea of kind of where to go. So there are some user guides, some product documentation specifically for the F5 IPAM controller. There's also product documentation for the F5 IPAM controller on GitHub, as well as lots of CIS documents specifically with related to the IPAM controller. But this is going to specifically focus on the troubleshooting piece. And so the first thing I'm going to get into is for IPAM. That's the IPAM controller. And for CIS to work correctly, the role-based accounts, specifically the service accounts and the service account bindings, have to be correct. So let's go and take a look at what I mean by this. I'm going to open these two, and I'm going to open the other one as well. So for CIS is really important that it has a couple things. The first thing is that because CIS is going to read and write from the IPAM controller CRD, it needs to have specific permissions. And so these permissions that it needs specifically for the what we call the FIC IPAM, which is the IPAM controller, is to pull the IP address from the status. That is so important, to pull the IP address from the status, because that is where the IP address is stored, specifically for that host. And so that's one of the reasons why CIS needs access to that IPAM CRD, because that's how the information is stored. I'm going to show you that in a second, but this is really important. So you need to make sure that you have the latest verbiage. And the cluster role bindings are critical here. This file right here, this big IP controller cluster role binding file, is specifically for CIS. It has all the latest role-based authentication or cluster role, service accounts, everything that is part of the CIS 2.7 release. And so as you can see here, the service accounts specifically for CIS I'm using here as big IP controller and also as big IP controller. So these are my service accounts and my service account bindings, and including my cluster role bindings as well. So it's everything that you need. I highly recommend to stick with these names. If you start customizing this, potentially things can get a little trickier, because then you're going to be doing a little bit more Kubernetes troubleshooting. So this name is really important because this name maps back to the controller name for the specific service account. So if we go take a look at the CIS deployment, at the bottom of the CIS deployment here for IPAM, you can see there is the service account. So the service account matches the deployment file. And so that is really critical on the CIS side. They have to match up. On the IPAM side, let's go take a look at the specific IPAM service account and cluster role bindings. So you can see there's the service account right here, IPAM controller. In this case is what I'm using, IPAM controller. This is for the service account. This is for the service account for the cluster role binding. So this name is going to map back to the deployment name So if we go into the deployment name, this name is going to map back here, and you can see there they are right there, service account and the service account name. They map back. That is critical. So taking a look at the documentation, if we go through it, you can see it here. So you can actually do this command to make sure that you have some of this information correct. And so we will get into that in a second. So that is really really critical with regards to those service accounts and the service account bindings, specifically for that piece. And so there's actually a couple things that I can do, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump a little bit ahead here, because I want to kind of show you how you can actually see that. So here in step 3, you can actually see it. However, there's one thing that's really important. Before you can even start the IPAM controller, the persistent volume has to be there. So that's one of the reasons why persistent volume I put is in step 1. But I want to kind of show you that you will get to this information later, right? Where you see right here to validate these criteria here. But not only will IPAM not run if the service account's correct, but since we're using a persistent volume, the persistent volume has to be there. So you can actually see the persistent volume if I actually go and take a look. So let's go and start at step 1 here. Now that we've talked about how to actually deploy CIS with the correct RBAC and IPAM with the correct RBAC, let's look at the persistent volume, because this is persistent volume created in my hosted Kubernetes. Everyone could potentially have a different persistent volume if you're using Rancher, or if you're using, let's say, Azure. There are different ways of doing this, but I am going to document what I have, and that is native Kubernetes. I believe this is like 119.120 native Kubernetes with the persistent volume. So the first thing I want to do is I want to show you the persistent volume. Let's go back here. I want to show you the persistent volume deployment. So let me scroll up to the persistent volume file here. There's a couple things that are important. So these are literally what you need. The size that I've created of the persistent volume is 1 gig. The persistent volume name is local PV. The path that I've given it is temp CIS IPAM, and of course the node. And then of course here again is the persistent volume claim. So let's go and take a look at what that actually looks like within Kubernetes. And we can actually go ahead and simply just run these commands. We could actually do a get the persistent volume. So you can see there is the name of the persistent volume. It's called local PV. It's 1 gig. It talks about the access mode. It's bound, and kind of there's the claim right there. So the persistent volume, there's the claim. And so that's really important. So if we go look here, we can see that there's our name and there's our persistent volume claim, and of course the size. If we go back and look at the PVC, we can actually see this is the PVC. So there's the local PV. This is the binding, and you can see it's bound. It's bound to this volume. We have 1 gig. So this is actually really good. So for IPAM to start, we have to have this. We also have to have one other additional piece of information. So the second thing that we have to have is that we have to specify where the persistent volume is, which is right here. The persistent volume is getting created on node 1. And on that persistent volume, we're specifying our storage class, local storage, and we're specifying a folder. And so this folder has to exist, right? And this folder has to have read-write permissions. So make sure that you give and elevate the correct permissions to this folder. And as you can see here, that when I create the file, the folder is getting created. The folder is created. You need to pre-create this folder, and IPAM will write to it. You can actually see IPAM is actually writing to it. So if we take a look at Kubernetes right here, and if I actually do an ls and a pwd, you can actually see that I'm actually in this file. And if I do an ls minus lr, you can actually see what kind of that's specifically for that. But if I want to actually go and specify this temp file name CIS IPAM, so you can actually see what's actually happening there. Let me just go one step back and actually run that again, so you can actually see the level. There we go, and that's the one file in there. So you can kind of see how that works. It's really important. If you're seeing that your container is trying to start, basically says container starting, container starting, container starting, it'll drive you crazy. If you see that and the container just does not start, you can always describe the container, but what will end up happening is that you'll probably find that you're going to be running into this problem. Great. So now that I've showed you the persistent volume and the claim, and you can see it, there is one potential command that I could run to see. It says that there is no resources found in kube namespace. Okay, so at this point there's nothing running up here. There is no events at this time taking place, so no resources found. Nothing. Okay, let's continue. Great, so now that we've looked at our persistent volume and that we know that our persistent volume is created and that we have local storage and we've created this path, we can actually move forward. And by this is actually something that you probably want to do before you deploy IPAM, because without the persistent volume, IPAM's not going to start. So once you have your persistent volume created, you're kind of good to go. One thing that I noticed, if I actually delete the F5 IPAM persistent volume YAML file, it actually removes this path, this file. And I think that's actually an issue within IPAM that actually does need to be resolved. But do notice that. So when you recreate the persistent volume again, you would have to go recreate those files. So that is really important to know. So one good way of being able to see, I really like this command, to see that your role-based authentication, to see that your persistent volume is correct, to see that your CIS and IPAM controller are running, is to use this kubectl log command, because it's going to get all pods for these two namespaces, specifically for CIS and IPAM. It's going to give you their IP addresses, how long they're running for, and where they're running. I really like that, and that is quite detailed, and that gives us some really good information on that. What you can also do is you can actually go one step forward. We talked a little bit about the service accounts and the binding. You can actually go one step forward and then pull this information as well, and you can actually see the status of the CIS controller, and you can actually pull this information as well for the IPAM controller, and you will notice the correct service accounts, cluster role bindings, etc. This has to match for this to work. If this doesn't match, it's not going to work. The next step that you can do is when you create your virtual server, if things are not working right, you will see errors here. And so what this command is actually going to do is it's actually going to show us the communication of the API. It's going to show us the response, the posting, and it's going to show us what's coming from IPAM. So it's going to show us the entire handshake between CIS, IPAM, between CIS and the big IP. So it's really, really useful command to troubleshoot this, because this command is pretty much going to show you everything that you need, and this one command will give you a really good indication of how to troubleshoot. So if you see errors here, you pretty much are going to know, because you can see here that I am getting the big IP version. So you can see here, this is AS3 information right here. Now what happened is we created the IPAM resource, and you can actually see here that the IPAM resource is getting created. We're waiting for the IPAM controller to sync. You can see we're syncing the IPAM controller here, and so there is some information there. Now we see there's an update. The IPAM controller CR, which is the custom resource. So you can actually see we're finished syncing the virtual server. So with the following namespace. So this is the information that we're syncing here, and you can actually see that there is the status information. So now that we actually have the status information updated in the IPAM CR, which is the resource definition, at this point we can actually take that configuration. CIS can get it, right? CIS can pull that configuration. Postman accepted the configuration, right? So this is CIS now. So CIS is posting that configuration to big IP, and here's the post. This is the API posting that configuration, and you can actually see the response that this is actually a good, the label, the status is okay, and it kind of shows the information. So useful. It's really, really, really useful. So this is absolutely required to troubleshoot CIS and IPAM working together. The last one is to take a look at the IPAM CR to make sure that this information is there. And so this would be the last step, or the last step that you would do, and you can actually run this command. This command, what it will do is it will actually pull this IPAM here. So if you make changes to your configuration, you need to make sure that this file is removed, this IPAM file, because if, for example, you change your deployment name won't match up. It shows you kind of what other things are information here, but if you're missing this information here, what will happen is IPAM controller will log an error, and it will basically say that it cannot update. So there's a permissions problem. So if you're trying to deploy your CRD and nothing happens, the log on the IPAM controller, that log that we have above, will basically show you everything, because the IPAM controller is not getting updated. And so this will show you the exact issue. So if you follow these 5 steps, will help you troubleshoot the CIS and IPAM controller, all the way from the persistent volume to making sure that your role-based authentication is correct, making sure that your CIS and IPAM controller is working correctly or running correctly with the correct permissions, making sure that if there's an error, we see and we're able to capture the right logs. And of course, number 5, making sure that the IPAM CRD is good. So that's a simple recap of how to troubleshoot F5 CIS IPAM working with the CIS controller. Thank you.